The people who laugh the loudest are often the least prepared for the moment silence answers them, and on a cool autumn morning the historic courthouse stood beneath a gray sky while attorneys, clerks, reporters, and visitors hurried through its marble entrance believing they already knew exactly who belonged inside those walls and who did not. Grace Walker walked through the front doors carrying a worn leather folder instead of an expensive briefcase, wearing a simple light blue blouse beneath a modest gray cardigan, dark slacks, and comfortable shoes that reflected practicality rather than prestige. Her quiet appearance attracted little attention until she entered courtroom 7, where an important civil hearing had already drawn a crowded audience eager to watch two respected legal teams argue a complicated dispute. Every seat was nearly filled, polished wooden benches stretched beneath tall windows, and the seal of the court overlooked the room with solemn dignity. Grace paused near the back, greeted the court officer with a gentle smile, and quietly accepted permission to sit in the final row. Around her, conversations continued in low voices as spectators studied thick legal files and whispered predictions about the outcome. At the front of the courtroom stood Richard Hayes, a confident senior prosecutor whose reputation for commanding arguments had earned admiration from younger attorneys throughout the county. Beside the defense table, Daniel Foster carefully organized documents while reviewing handwritten notes, aware that the morning would demand precision and patience. High above them, Judge Eleanor Brooks prepared the docket with calm professionalism, bringing an immediate sense of order to the room the moment she entered. Grace watched everything in complete silence, occasionally opening the worn folder resting on her lap before making a short handwritten note with a fountain pen that looked older than many of the lawyers present. A few nearby observers glanced toward her simple clothing and quietly assumed she must be a family member of one of the parties or perhaps a curious visitor with little understanding of legal procedure. One young attorney even smiled politely before whispering to a colleague that important hearings always attracted spectators who underestimated how complex the law could become. Grace appeared not to notice. Her attention remained fixed on the exhibits displayed before the court, her eyes moving carefully from one document to another with remarkable concentration. As preliminary arguments began, Richard spoke confidently, presenting timelines, statutory references, and supporting records with polished certainty that filled the courtroom. Several spectators nodded with admiration while reporters prepared their notebooks. Grace listened without interruption, yet every few minutes she quietly marked another observation inside her folder as though she had recognized something no one else had seen. Daniel noticed the unusual habit from across the room but quickly returned his focus to the proceedings. After nearly an hour, the judge invited brief procedural comments before moving to the next stage of the hearing. Grace slowly rose from her seat with calm respect and politely asked whether the court might permit one short observation regarding a document that had just been referenced. Before Judge Brooks could answer, several people turned toward the simply dressed woman with visible surprise. Richard allowed himself a restrained smile that carried unmistakable skepticism, convinced that the quiet stranger standing in the back of the courtroom had wandered into a legal discussion far beyond her understanding. The room waited, curiosity mixing with quiet amusement, while Grace remained perfectly composed, unaware that within moments every assumption surrounding her presence would begin to change. Grace Walker remained standing with quiet composure, her hands resting gently on the worn leather folder she carried, while the courtroom settled into an uneasy silence filled with curiosity and restrained amusement. Richard Hayes looked toward the back of the room with a polite smile that carried unmistakable disbelief. After years inside courtrooms, he believed he could recognize legal experience the moment someone walked through the door, and the simply dressed woman standing before him did not fit the image he had built in his mind. He thanked her for her interest before suggesting that the legal arguments had already been carefully prepared by licensed professionals and that additional comments from the public would only delay the proceedings. A few quiet chuckles drifted through the gallery as several spectators exchanged knowing glances, convinced the brief interruption would end within moments. Grace did not react to the laughter. Instead, she waited patiently until the room became quiet again before respectfully addressing Judge Eleanor Brooks. She explained that she wished only to point out what appeared to be a discrepancy between two exhibits that had been discussed during the morning session. Her tone remained calm, measured, and completely free of emotion. Judge Brooks studied Grace for a brief moment before asking whether she possessed any legal connection to the matter before the court. Grace answered honestly that she was not representing either party but had been invited by a family acquaintance to observe the hearing because of her long-standing interest in legal analysis. Richard allowed himself another restrained smile and quietly remarked that courtroom procedure depended upon evidence rather than observations from spectators. Although his words remained professional, the subtle confidence behind them reflected his certainty that the discussion had already ended. Daniel Foster, seated at the defense table, glanced briefly toward Grace with mild curiosity. Something about the way she spoke, her careful choice of legal terminology, and her complete lack of nervousness seemed unusual for an ordinary observer. Before he could fully consider the thought, Judge Brooks requested that Grace limit her comment to one specific point. Grace thanked the court for the opportunity and slowly opened her folder. Without searching through loose papers or hesitating for even a moment, she identified the exhibit number from memory before calmly explaining that the timeline referenced in one affidavit appeared inconsistent with a supporting financial document admitted earlier into evidence. She did not accuse anyone of misconduct. She merely suggested that the sequence of dates deserved careful review because the language contained within the filing could lead to an unintended misunderstanding of the chronology. Richard immediately replied that the timeline had already been examined by experienced attorneys and verified before submission. His confidence remained unshaken as several observers nodded in agreement. Grace simply inclined her head respectfully and answered that she understood, but politely invited the court to compare the filing dates rather than the signature dates because the distinction could materially affect how the document should be interpreted. The courtroom grew unexpectedly quiet. Daniel instinctively opened the referenced exhibit and slowly turned the pages. His expression changed almost immediately as his eyes moved from one document to another. Judge Brooks noticed the reaction and requested the clerk to display both exhibits side by side. The large courtroom monitor illuminated with the two records, and for the first time that morning every person inside the room focused not on Grace herself, but on the exact legal detail she had quietly identified. The laughter disappeared completely, replaced by a silence that suggested the first assumption made about the simple woman standing quietly at the back of the courtroom might have been the first serious mistake of the day. Every eye inside the courtroom shifted toward the large display as the two exhibits appeared side by side, their neatly typed pages illuminated beneath the soft courtroom lighting. The atmosphere that had only moments earlier carried quiet amusement now transformed into complete concentration. Judge Eleanor Brooks leaned forward slightly, carefully reading the filing dates while the courtroom clerk highlighted the sections Grace Walker had calmly referenced. Daniel Foster turned another page in the official record, then compared it once more with the affidavit displayed on the screen. His expression slowly changed from curiosity to genuine surprise. Without saying a word, he quietly underlined the same discrepancy Grace had identified within seconds of seeing the documents. Richard Hayes remained standing with composed confidence, convinced that the apparent inconsistency could be explained through ordinary procedural differences. He respectfully informed the court that filing timelines often involved administrative processing that did not affect the legal validity of supporting evidence. His explanation sounded reasonable, and several observers nodded as though expecting the discussion to conclude. Grace waited patiently until Richard finished speaking before asking permission to clarify one additional point. Judge Brooks granted the request. Grace thanked the court and calmly explained that she was not questioning the authenticity of the documents themselves. Instead, she directed everyone's attention to the sequence in which one filing had been referenced during the morning argument. According to the order presented before the court, one conclusion depended entirely upon the assumption that the financial record existed before a particular affidavit had been prepared. However, the official filing history displayed the opposite sequence, suggesting that one interpretation relied upon an incorrect chronological foundation. She spoke slowly, choosing each word with remarkable precision, never raising her voice or attempting to embarrass anyone involved. The courtroom became so quiet that even the turning of a single page could be heard. Judge Brooks carefully reread the documents while the clerk confirmed each filing date from the electronic court record. Daniel looked toward Richard with growing concern before quietly acknowledging that Grace's observation deserved serious consideration. Several attorneys seated in the gallery opened their own copies of the exhibits, following the discussion line by line. One after another, expressions of quiet confidence slowly gave way to thoughtful silence. Richard reviewed the documents himself, this time far more carefully than before. Although he remained composed, the certainty that had defined his earlier remarks began to soften. He realized that Grace had not interrupted the hearing with speculation or opinion. She had identified a factual detail hidden within the official record that no one else in the courtroom had noticed despite hours of preparation. Judge Brooks finally looked toward Grace and asked where she had developed such a precise understanding of procedural chronology and evidentiary interpretation. Grace offered only a gentle smile before answering that careful reading often reveals details overlooked by hurried assumptions. She deliberately avoided discussing her background, allowing the focus to remain entirely upon the evidence itself. Her humility only deepened the curiosity filling the courtroom. The spectators who had quietly laughed only minutes earlier now watched her with growing respect, wondering how a simply dressed woman sitting quietly in the last row possessed a level of legal analysis that challenged experienced professionals. The hearing continued, but the atmosphere had changed completely. No one viewed Grace as an ordinary observer any longer. Without seeking attention, she had shifted the direction of the entire proceeding using nothing more than patience, careful reasoning, and an unwavering respect for the truth contained within the written record. Judge Eleanor Brooks rested her hands gently upon the bench as the quiet discussion inside the courtroom gradually settled into complete silence. The earlier confidence that had filled the room had been replaced by careful attention, and every attorney now watched Grace Walker with a level of respect that had not existed only minutes before. Rather than immediately continue the hearing, Judge Brooks instructed the clerk to retrieve the complete filing history from the electronic court archive so every date and procedural entry could be independently verified. The request itself reflected something extraordinary. The court was no longer reviewing Grace's observation as a casual comment from a spectator. It had become an important legal issue worthy of formal examination. Richard Hayes remained standing at counsel table with remarkable professionalism despite the growing uncertainty surrounding his earlier conclusions. He quietly reviewed the exhibits once again, this time comparing every reference against the official filing chronology displayed on the courtroom monitor. His expression no longer reflected skepticism. Instead, it revealed the concentration of an experienced attorney determined to understand precisely where the discrepancy had originated. Daniel Foster carefully organized additional records and soon discovered another supporting document that strengthened Grace's analysis. He respectfully informed the court that the newly reviewed filing sequence appeared entirely consistent with the observation Grace had presented. A quiet murmur passed through the spectators before fading almost immediately beneath Judge Brooks's request for continued order. Grace remained exactly where she had been standing since asking permission to speak. She neither celebrated nor displayed satisfaction. Her calm expression remained unchanged, her hands resting gently upon the leather folder as though she had expected nothing more than an opportunity for the court to carefully examine the evidence. Judge Brooks looked directly toward Grace before asking whether she would be willing to explain how she had recognized the discrepancy so quickly while trained legal professionals had overlooked it during preparation. Grace answered with characteristic humility. She explained that every legal document tells a chronological story, and when one date appears inconsistent with the sequence created by the surrounding evidence, the entire narrative deserves another careful reading. She emphasized that she had not searched for mistakes. She had simply followed the documents one page at a time until the timeline no longer aligned naturally. Her explanation was remarkably clear, avoiding technical language while revealing an unusually disciplined method of legal reasoning. Several young attorneys sitting in the gallery quietly began taking notes, recognizing that they had just witnessed a practical lesson more valuable than many formal lectures. Richard slowly closed one of the binders before respectfully acknowledging that Grace's observation had identified an issue requiring additional review. His words carried genuine professionalism rather than reluctant concession. Judge Brooks nodded appreciatively, thanking both counsel for their cooperation before announcing a brief recess so the court could verify every relevant filing with complete accuracy. As everyone slowly rose from their seats, conversations remained unusually subdued. The laughter that had greeted Grace's first request to speak had completely disappeared. In its place stood thoughtful curiosity. Daniel watched Grace gather her folder with quiet admiration, increasingly convinced that her understanding of legal procedure came from years of experience rather than casual interest. Yet Grace offered no explanation about her past. She simply thanked the judge for allowing the documents to speak for themselves and quietly stepped aside near one of the courtroom windows, allowing the attorneys to continue their work. Sunlight filtered across the polished wooden floor while the courthouse settled into reflective silence, and for the first time that morning nearly everyone inside realized they were no longer observing an ordinary hearing. They were witnessing the quiet authority of someone whose brilliance needed no introduction because the evidence itself had already begun speaking on her behalf. When the court reconvened after the brief recess, the atmosphere inside courtroom 7 had changed in a way that every person present could feel without anyone saying a single word. The quiet conversations that normally accompanied a recess had disappeared, replaced by an unusual sense of anticipation. Attorneys returned to their tables carrying additional case files, reporters prepared fresh pages in their notebooks, and spectators leaned forward with genuine curiosity. Grace Walker quietly resumed her place near the back of the courtroom, standing beside the polished wooden bench with the same calm posture she had maintained since the beginning of the hearing. She neither sought attention nor attempted to move closer to the front of the room. Judge Eleanor Brooks entered once again, bringing the courtroom to order before announcing that the filing chronology had been independently verified through the official court record. Every date Grace had identified was accurate. The discrepancy was genuine, and the court would now reconsider portions of the legal analysis in light of the corrected sequence. Richard Hayes listened respectfully as the judge summarized the findings. Although his confidence remained steady, there was now a visible humility in the way he reviewed his notes. He no longer viewed Grace as an uninformed observer. Instead, he understood that she possessed a level of legal reasoning capable of recognizing details that experienced attorneys had unintentionally overlooked. Daniel Foster carefully reorganized his presentation and quietly incorporated the corrected timeline into his argument. He realized that the entire direction of the hearing had shifted because one patient observer had chosen to speak with respect rather than remain silent. Judge Brooks then invited Grace to explain whether the corrected chronology suggested any broader legal implication beyond the filing sequence itself. Grace accepted the invitation with quiet gratitude before opening her worn leather folder once more. Without referring to lengthy notes, she calmly guided the courtroom through each document one page at a time, connecting filing dates, supporting exhibits, witness statements, and statutory references into a clear chronological structure that unfolded with remarkable precision. She never attempted to argue the case for either party. Instead, she focused entirely upon helping the court understand how the evidence naturally connected when arranged in its proper order. Each explanation was concise, carefully reasoned, and supported directly by the official record displayed on the courtroom monitor. As Grace continued, the room grew progressively quieter. Even the experienced attorneys sitting in the gallery began following her analysis with careful attention. Daniel found himself turning each page almost simultaneously with her explanation, discovering that every reference she made corresponded perfectly with the documents before him. Richard slowly lowered his pen, no longer searching for weaknesses in her reasoning because each point rested firmly upon verifiable evidence rather than opinion. Judge Brooks occasionally asked brief questions seeking clarification, and Grace answered each one with remarkable composure, citing procedural principles and statutory language entirely from memory while remaining respectful to everyone involved. No one could understand how someone who had entered the courtroom dressed so simply and sitting silently among the spectators possessed such extraordinary command of legal analysis. The spectators who had quietly smiled when she first requested permission to speak now watched with expressions of genuine admiration. Grace herself remained completely unchanged. Her voice never became louder, her posture never became more confident, and she never acknowledged the growing attention surrounding her. She appeared interested only in helping the court arrive at the most accurate understanding possible. As the final page of the document was displayed on the courtroom monitor, a profound silence settled across the room. It was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence that follows undeniable clarity, when every assumption begins giving way to undeniable respect. The hearing continued with a level of concentration that transformed the atmosphere inside courtroom 7 into something few people present had ever experienced. Every document placed before the court now received careful attention, not because the evidence had changed, but because everyone understood that a single overlooked detail had already altered the course of the proceeding. Judge Eleanor Brooks reviewed the revised chronology once more before looking toward Daniel Foster and Richard Hayes, inviting both attorneys to continue their arguments using the corrected record. Daniel stood first, incorporating the newly clarified sequence into his presentation with renewed confidence. Several points that had previously appeared uncertain now formed a consistent legal framework, and the defense argument became noticeably stronger as each document aligned naturally with the verified timeline. Richard listened carefully without interruption, occasionally making notes while comparing statutory references against the corrected filing order. His professionalism remained evident, yet it was equally clear that Grace Walker's observations had fundamentally changed the legal landscape of the case. As the discussion progressed, Daniel found himself repeatedly glancing toward Grace, unable to ignore the remarkable precision with which she had interpreted the evidence. During a brief pause in the proceedings, he quietly approached the back of the courtroom and respectfully introduced himself. Grace greeted him with the same calm smile she had offered everyone else throughout the day. Daniel thanked her for helping the court identify the discrepancy before asking, with sincere curiosity, where she had learned to analyze legal records with such extraordinary accuracy. Grace answered modestly that many years spent studying the law had taught her to respect the importance of chronology, because facts often reveal themselves when every event is placed in its proper order. Her reply was simple, yet something about the confidence behind her words awakened a distant memory in Daniel's mind. He looked more closely at the worn leather folder she carried and noticed a faded set of initials embossed near one corner. The initials seemed strangely familiar. Returning to counsel table, Daniel quietly searched through an archived legal directory stored on his tablet. Within moments his eyes widened. An older professional photograph appeared on the screen beside the name Grace Walker, recognized years earlier as one of the state's most respected appellate attorneys whose carefully reasoned legal writings had been studied by countless young lawyers before she unexpectedly retired from public practice. Daniel looked toward Grace once again, now seeing not an ordinary courtroom visitor but a legal mind whose work had quietly influenced an entire generation of attorneys. He remained silent, choosing not to interrupt the hearing with the discovery. Judge Brooks continued examining the corrected record while Richard presented a revised argument that respectfully acknowledged the importance of the newly established chronology. Throughout the courtroom, experienced attorneys listened with unusual humility, realizing that the woman they had initially dismissed possessed a level of legal understanding that few practicing professionals could equal. Grace herself never attempted to reveal her background. She remained focused entirely upon the evidence before the court, allowing every conclusion to arise naturally from the documents rather than from her reputation. The realization spread slowly through Daniel's thoughts. The remarkable precision, the calm confidence, the flawless memory for procedural rules, and the complete absence of any desire for recognition all now made perfect sense. Yet no one else in the courtroom had reached that conclusion. For the moment, Grace remained exactly what she appeared to be in the eyes of most observers, a quietly dressed woman standing respectfully near the back of the courtroom, while the extraordinary truth about her legal career waited patiently for its own moment to be discovered. Daniel Foster quietly closed the legal directory on his tablet, but the discovery refused to leave his thoughts. He looked once more toward Grace Walker, who remained standing near the back of the courtroom with the same quiet humility she had displayed since the hearing began. Nothing about her appearance suggested the remarkable professional history he had just uncovered, yet every careful observation she had offered now matched the reputation of the attorney whose appellate work had once become required reading for young lawyers across the state. Daniel understood that revealing her identity in the middle of the hearing would shift attention away from the evidence, and he sensed that Grace herself had intentionally avoided mentioning her past for exactly that reason. Judge Eleanor Brooks called the courtroom back to order, inviting final legal analysis before determining how the corrected record would affect the proceedings. Richard Hayes stood with renewed professionalism, carefully acknowledging that the verified chronology required several conclusions presented earlier to be reconsidered. His voice carried humility rather than defensiveness, and the courtroom recognized the quiet dignity with which he accepted the correction. Grace remained silent until the judge respectfully asked whether she wished to clarify one final procedural issue before the court concluded its review. Grace thanked the judge and slowly approached the display showing the verified timeline. Without dramatic gestures or emotional language, she explained that the corrected sequence did more than adjust a single filing date. It restored the logical relationship between every supporting exhibit, allowing each document to be evaluated within its proper legal context. She calmly demonstrated how one mistaken assumption had gradually influenced every conclusion that followed, creating an appearance of consistency that disappeared once the original chronology was restored. Her explanation unfolded with remarkable clarity. Every statement pointed directly to evidence already contained within the official record. Every legal principle she referenced connected naturally to the documents before the court. She never criticized either attorney, never questioned anyone's integrity, and never suggested that the mistake resulted from anything other than ordinary human oversight. The courtroom listened without interruption. Even the reporters stopped writing for several moments, choosing instead to absorb the quiet precision of her reasoning. Judge Brooks asked several thoughtful questions regarding procedural interpretation, and Grace answered each one from memory, citing well-established legal principles with effortless accuracy. Richard followed each explanation while reviewing the same authorities in his own reference materials, discovering that every citation proved correct. A respectful silence settled over the courtroom unlike anything experienced earlier that morning. Daniel finally rose from counsel table and addressed the court. With sincere respect, he explained that during the recess he had recognized Grace Walker's name through archived legal publications and confirmed that she had once been among the most respected appellate attorneys in the state before choosing to leave active practice many years earlier. A quiet wave of astonishment passed through the gallery. Several experienced lawyers exchanged surprised glances, immediately recognizing the significance of the name. Richard looked toward Grace with genuine admiration, realizing that the woman he had initially dismissed possessed a legal mind whose published work had influenced countless attorneys, including many still practicing today. Grace accepted the unexpected attention with visible humility, explaining that titles and past accomplishments mattered far less than ensuring the court reached the most accurate understanding possible. She had never come seeking recognition. She had only hoped that the documents would receive the careful reading every legal matter deserved. As her final words faded into the quiet courtroom, no one remembered the simple clothing that had first invited quiet judgment. They remembered only the extraordinary clarity of a woman whose brilliance had spoken more powerfully than any introduction ever could. The courtroom remained unusually quiet even after the surprise surrounding Grace Walker's identity had settled into respectful understanding. Judge Eleanor Brooks looked across the room before gently thanking Grace for the professionalism she had demonstrated from the moment she entered the courthouse until the final stages of the hearing. The judge observed that genuine expertise often reveals itself not through titles or appearances but through disciplined reasoning and unwavering respect for the law. Her words carried weight throughout the courtroom because everyone present had witnessed that lesson unfold before their own eyes. Richard Hayes slowly rose from counsel table and turned toward Grace with sincere humility. His confident posture remained, yet the certainty that had once rested upon assumptions had disappeared completely. He admitted that when Grace first requested permission to speak he had judged her based upon appearance rather than substance. He explained that years of courtroom experience had unintentionally taught him to recognize familiar patterns, but on this occasion those habits had prevented him from recognizing extraordinary ability standing only a few feet away. Grace listened without interruption and acknowledged his honesty with a gentle smile. She answered that every professional occasionally allows first impressions to influence judgment and that true integrity begins with the willingness to recognize those moments and learn from them. There was no trace of resentment in her voice. She spoke with the calm confidence of someone who valued growth more than personal vindication. Daniel Foster thanked Grace for the remarkable clarity she had brought to the proceeding, explaining that countless younger attorneys had studied legal opinions bearing her name without ever imagining they would one day watch her quietly guide a courtroom back toward the proper interpretation of the evidence. Grace responded modestly that every published opinion, every courtroom argument, and every legal principle ultimately existed for one purpose alone: helping the law serve fairness through careful reasoning rather than personal pride. Judge Brooks then summarized the court's findings using the corrected chronology and directed that the remaining legal questions proceed upon the verified record. She noted that the revised analysis reflected a more accurate understanding of the evidence because one thoughtful observer had chosen respectful participation instead of silent hesitation. The spectators remained completely still, recognizing that they had witnessed something far more meaningful than an ordinary hearing. Reporters quietly closed their notebooks, aware that the most memorable story from the day would not concern legal strategy alone but the quiet lesson about humility that had unfolded before them. As the hearing concluded, several attorneys approached Grace with sincere appreciation, asking thoughtful questions about legal reasoning and document analysis. She answered each inquiry with patience, encouraging careful reading, intellectual curiosity, and respect for opposing viewpoints. She never emphasized her accomplishments or discussed her distinguished career unless directly asked. Instead, she repeatedly directed attention back toward the importance of evidence, preparation, and fairness. Richard remained nearby, reflecting silently upon how quickly appearances had influenced his first impression that morning. He realized that the greatest lesson he would carry from the courtroom had little to do with statutes or procedure. It concerned the discipline of extending equal respect before forming conclusions. Grace quietly gathered her worn leather folder, thanked the judge, acknowledged both legal teams with genuine courtesy, and prepared to leave the courtroom exactly as she had entered it, without seeking recognition, applause, or admiration. Yet everyone watching understood that the quiet woman walking toward the courthouse doors had permanently changed the way they would look at every unfamiliar face entering a courtroom in the future. Several weeks passed after the remarkable hearing, yet the quiet events of that autumn morning continued to influence everyone who had witnessed them. Inside the courthouse, conversations among judges, attorneys, and law clerks often returned to the simple lesson that had emerged from Courtroom 7. New attorneys entering the profession heard the story not as a tale about embarrassment or personal triumph, but as a reminder that careful listening and intellectual humility remain among the greatest strengths any legal professional can possess. Judge Eleanor Brooks occasionally referred to the experience during educational programs for young lawyers, explaining that justice depends upon evidence, patience, and the willingness to reconsider even strongly held conclusions when new understanding emerges. Richard Hayes carried the lesson with him into every future hearing. Before each proceeding began, he made a quiet habit of greeting every person entering the courtroom with the same professional respect regardless of appearance or circumstance. His colleagues noticed the subtle change, though few understood the deeply personal reason behind it. He no longer relied upon first impressions to shape expectations, choosing instead to let preparation, character, and thoughtful reasoning reveal themselves naturally. Daniel Foster continued building his legal career with renewed appreciation for disciplined analysis. The worn appellate opinions written years earlier by Grace Walker returned to his desk, not merely as historical references but as daily reminders that the strongest legal arguments grow from patient attention to detail rather than dramatic presentation. Whenever younger associates sought guidance, Daniel encouraged them to read every document carefully, respect every participant in the legal process, and remember that extraordinary wisdom often arrives without announcing itself. Grace Walker quietly returned to her ordinary routine, declining interview requests and public recognition that followed the hearing. She believed the court had reached the correct result because everyone involved had ultimately chosen truth over pride, and that outcome mattered far more than personal attention. Her modest home, peaceful mornings, and quiet life suited her perfectly. Occasionally she accepted invitations to speak with law students, never discussing her accomplishments at length but instead encouraging future attorneys to approach every case with curiosity, fairness, and respect for every individual who entered a courtroom. She reminded them that legal knowledge becomes truly valuable only when guided by humility. On one crisp afternoon, Grace walked once again past the courthouse carrying the same worn leather folder that had accompanied her throughout the hearing. Several courthouse employees recognized her and warmly wished her a pleasant day. She returned each greeting with genuine kindness before continuing along the tree-lined sidewalk beneath the gentle autumn sunlight. She looked no different from the quiet woman who had first entered the courthouse weeks earlier, and that simplicity remained exactly as she preferred it. The marble steps behind her continued welcoming strangers every day, each carrying unseen experiences, talents, and stories that no appearance could ever fully reveal. Life inside the courthouse moved forward, yet those who had been present during that unforgettable hearing never again viewed unfamiliar faces with casual assumptions. They had learned that true brilliance rarely announces itself through expensive clothing, impressive introductions, or loud confidence. It reveals itself through calm preparation, quiet integrity, and the courage to speak with respect when truth deserves another careful look. And long after the legal documents had been filed away and the courtroom lights dimmed at the close of each day, one lesson remained permanently engraved within every heart that had witnessed the quiet woman who asked for nothing more than an opportunity to let the evidence speak for itself.